Hi, everyone. So I'm Kellyanne, and I'm a bookseller at Mysterious Galaxy. I know if you've joined us for any of our other events, you're probably used to seeing Constance. But tonight I'm going to be hosting, and tonight I have the pleasure of introducing our authors. Tonight we're joined by Kali Wallace, celebrating her new book, Dead Space. Dead Space is an awesome sci-fi thriller about Hester Marley, who is the survivor of a terrorist attack. And she is now working this dead-end security job for an asteroid mining company. And all of that kind of goes sideways when someone from her past, who is also a survivor of the terrorist attack that changed her life, turns up murdered in one of these asteroid mines. Joining us also is her conversation partner, our moderator, Audrey Coulthurst. Audrey Coulthurst is the YA author of several books, including the Of Fire and Stars series. So if you guys haven't joined us tonight, just want to do a quick crowdcast how-to for our audience. Down below our video, you'll see a green signed books, personalized books button, so that will take you directly to buy Dead Space. If you haven't already done it, you should totally do it because we're getting signed and personalized books. And then below that, there's the Ask a Question button. So please, please, please ask the authors any questions that you want, and then you can vote for whichever questions you want answered the most. And yeah, with that, I'm going to pass it off to Audrey. I will be back at the end of the event. You guys have a great event.
Thank you.
Yay. Hi, Kali.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up.
So great to see familiar names and some faces out there and some like cool little robot things. Anyway, since we're here to talk about Dead Space, I think one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot about this book, and something that, I don't know, everybody knows how you love to genre hop and cross age categories like it's nothing at all. But Dead Space is really at its heart a mystery, which so I think it'd be really interesting to hear kind of what your particular challenges were and joys were with writing a mystery in this novel.
It is a mystery novel, and I always tend to write a little bit of a mystery, which is on the one hand, it's kind of a cheat because it's easy to have a plot if you have a mystery. It's like, oh, what do they need to do? They need to solve the mystery. But on the other hand, I even though mysteries are, I think, pretty hard to write and write well, I really enjoy the challenge. I enjoy like the problem solving puzzle building aspect of it. And so that's always fun to figure out who knows what at what point, and why do they know it, and how do they act on it? Because there's always, in a mystery, you always have a whole host of characters who know more than your point of view character. And that can be a lot of fun to play with. And just from a pure writing, like words on the page, sentence level standpoint, I really love the aspect of writing that is putting hints in to help sort of people, like clues, little hints, little foreshadowing to sort of build up what I'm trying to lead people to. So I enjoy all those aspects of writing a mystery. That's the fun part. The hard part is that it has to make sense. It has to follow naturally. Like you want to feel like you are like not so much like pulling readers toward a conclusion, but like pushing them. You want them to feel like they get there like just a beat before the characters do, so they can feel smart and have that, like when we read mysteries and we're like, aha, that's exciting. Like there's a lot of enjoyment in that. And I love reading mysteries. That's probably the genre that I read the most. So, I'm trying to recapture that feeling. And that's that, the pacing and the like layering of information is not easy to do. It's very hard to do, but I enjoy them. So I keep trying.
Yeah, they can be really challenging. I had a bit of a mystery in my first book, and I remember just beating my head against the wall trying to get that right. And so much of it had to happen in reverse engineering. It was like,
where you want it to go, and right. you know where your characters start, and it's like, okay, how do you make all the steps in between feel believable. You don't want your characters to be too smart. You don't want them to be too stupid, because that's frustrating. You don't want anything to rely on just random coincidence, because that's also frustrating. And I think, mystery is such a prevalent genre in the world. Like, we've all watched mystery shows, read mystery books, like from the time we read, like Nancy Drew or Encyclopedia Brown, all the way up until, watching Law and Order, CSI, like it's everywhere. And so I think everyone knows the beats of a mystery, and to make that feel fresh and not like predictable or like eye-rollingly familiar is not easy. And yet, people keep writing mysteries that are good. So something about it keeps bringing us back.
I think the setting does you a lot of favors, though, in Dead Space as well, because it's such a different setting to be writing like a sci-fi mystery as opposed to like a police procedural or, something that we see a lot more day to day. So having that like closed claustrophobic setting and like, but still the mystery being very present and not really knowing what's going on. And then of course, all the characters having very different motives for what they're doing and why they're keeping secrets that they're keeping and things like that is pretty fun. I think
you can get away with a lot by setting a story in space, but also like sci-fi mystery, sci-fi noir it's a genre that a lot of people love, but there isn't actually a huge amount of it out there. It's not super common. And so it is fun to sort of bring in that like kind of grim, gritty, like near futurist feeling, and then just, put like basically a like the plot itself hopefully is surprising, but like the beats and the shape of the plot is like mystery thriller. Like it starts out mystery, it sort of ends much more like action thriller. Put it into a setting that is wholly invented and, therefore wholly under my control. I can make up all of it. And, there's a lot of fun there. For sure.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned too that, there's a little bit of a mystery in every book, I think, as you're reading through. So what was your writing process like for this book compared to some of your other books that you've written in other categories or genres?
This is the first book that I've written where it was entirely like I pitched the idea without having written a single word of it, and then wrote it like to an idea that I had sold. And I don't really recommend that. It's kind of a pain in the ass.
I feel that.
And lots of people like, I don't think you can't, when you read books that are pitched that way versus written, without that, you can't tell the difference in the end result. Like there are writers who write that way and do it brilliantly. For me, though, it felt very different because I knew the expectations were like, something similar to Salvation Day, but not quite like Salvation Day. Something that had similar twists, but not the same twists, and similar like emotional hooks, but not the same ones. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's like, in publishing, they often say like, do this, but different. When, it's a second book, and like this was the second adult book, so kind of treated as a second book for me. And so the process was like I had the whole basic idea sort of mapped out in my head ahead of time, which I almost never do. I'm not a person who plans ahead at all in my writing. And so it was, a lot of it felt like a lot more awkward as I was writing it. It felt like, why am I doing this? I know what's going to happen. Why, and like, I don't think it shows in the end. I think it reads pretty like fast paced and exciting, but for me, it felt like I was like filling in blanks that I had already had to figure out in order to explain the book I was going to write, if that makes sense. It wasn't the most fun way to write, I would say, but also I was writing a lot of it during, a very stressful time in the world, like the whole world. So it's hard to separate it from that.
Right. How do you feel like that influenced the book? I think you've written a little bit about that, but
yeah.
And article.
I think when I first started writing it back, I think it was 2018 sometime, I had like the idea I had was much more science fictional Like it was more about the artificial intelligence and like, I don't actually still, I know more about artificial intelligence than I did, but I'm not an expert, I promise. So like it was more about like the ideas behind that and like sort of the like philosophy behind it. But as the writing went on and the like process of revising went on, I was like, no, this isn't like a book with a lot of big science fictional ideas about AI. This is a crime novel, basically, that's about, you know, it's about a murder. It's about people who are, you know, doing the best they can in a really shitty situation, which is kind of the broad view of crime novel. Like, and so a lot of it became like, I think it became much less about like the big science fictional ideas, which were never, to be clear, never super clear in my mind in the first place. It was just like an ideas that I had, and much more just about, you know, how these characters' lives are fucked up, which is, I mean, that's kind of, isn't that every novel? But in this case, I think it made me think a lot more about, you know, like the emotional impact of all these science, like the science fictional setting and events in it, rather than the sort of more like bigger, like more philosophical ideas, I guess. It's not like, that makes it sound like a philosophical novel. It's really not. There's a lot of explosions in it.
I mean, I think it's a very human story in addition to having a lot of action, and that maybe that was part of the influence, it sounds like, of having lived the past year.
Yeah, no, it
really
was
fucked up, and we were all trying to deal with that.
Yeah, and a lot of it was like at some point during the revision process, I realized like, oh, I'm writing this book in, you know, revising it in early 2020, when probably almost exactly a year ago, when, you know, realizing like, oh God, so much is going wrong of the world that we live in, and there's no brakes to stop it, how badly it's going wrong. And so that was definitely influenced. Like, this is systems that people are living in that are not good for people. And I think a lot of that, like the theme that, you know, corporate capitalism sucks is not a terribly complex theme, but it is heartfelt in this particular book. So yeah, and I do think that became like, I focused more and more on that as the more I worked on it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So kind of, I guess within that context of everything that was going on in the outside world, and then what was kind of happening in the novel itself, figuring out how the story was becoming maybe a little less philosophical and more human, for the actual world building and all of that, like were there any influences there? Kind of how did you approach the world building in Dead Space? Because one of the things I love about this novel is I think how it's scary how real it feels, which is, I think, a lot driven by evil corporations doing evil stuff. Like, I've worked for a big evil corporation for a long time that did a lot of evil stuff, and it's like, oh, this feels very familiar. And so
yeah. No, and it was very deliberate. Like, it's I wanted it to feel like it's like, maybe not like, you know, 5 minutes in the future, but like a few hours in the future, like a future that we can see extrapolated from where we are now, because the world, like, and by world, I mean, like, you know, the whole solar system world, like, basically functions the same. It's driven very much by people with money. There's a huge wealth disparity. You know, people think that if they work hard and, you know, do the right things, they can climb up the ladder, but the game is rigged against them. So these were like very much conscious decisions that I made to make this like part of the world feel familiar, because I wanted it to be, you know, I wanted to set it in space. I wanted it to be near future. I wanted spaceships and all that stuff. But I also wanted it to feel like things are like mostly the same, kind of like, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same sort of thing. And I think that's, you know, it's something that you see in the Expanse series of books, and the TV show does that really well, where familiar enough that you look at it and you're like, yeah, I know how this world works. Like, I know how, these are the low wage workers doing the shitty job no one wants. These are the politicians taking advantage of them, blah, 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 all that stuff. Just, with the details and the historical backstory being its own thing. So yeah, that was all stuff that I decided very early on before I started writing. I wanted it to feel that way.
I think the medical debt was also very relatable. The fact that it takes bad accident.
I wish it wasn't, but
I know. Well, in America anyway, like one bad accident, everybody's one bad accident away from
right. Yeah,
which is scary to think about.
That was another thing that I decided very early on, that that is a thing that traps people, and that's the function it serves in the book, is that it has trapped the main character. So.
For sure, that makes sense. I think, I don't know, it gives Hester a lot as a character too, to have sort of the multi-layered background of like, well, this horrible thing happened to me and this is where I'm stuck now, but that's not all of who I am.
Right. And I think, part of it is I didn't even, this is how good authors are thinking about their own books, but I read a review just yesterday that said it's a story as much about processing grief as it is about solving a mystery. I was like, oh, wow, that's smart. But I wrote that. But I think that reviewer was spot on, because it is somebody who has been through a trauma that is, just one of these random horrible acts that just ruins people's lives, and has not really processed it at all. She's kind of in a holding pattern of, still hoping that life will get back to normal, even though normal has no meaning. And so part of the emotional journey in the book is, shoving her out of this holding pattern that she's in and making her take these actions that are very much outside of her personal comfort zone, and also outside of what this unfair world tells you you're supposed to do to get along. So,
right. I think it's a small thing too that's really I mean, maybe it's just a writer nerd thing to notice, but I think the other thing that I loved about it is how much she kind of curses her own injuries at various point, or her own prosthetic. The book, it just feels very human, just oh, my freaking prosthetic, that's not doing
right, because she is,
that's so real to when you have that kind of acquired disability or something like that, you live with it every day, you get used to a certain baseline level of pain,
right.
But oh, I'm going to be pushed to my limits having to deal with this really messed up situation. So I loved the small, just very human moments of her just being it's almost like that breakthrough of frustration is kind of, I don't know, in a way it's one of her main acknowledgments of
because
her world is and how bad
she is a disabled character, and it's fairly recent. I think I don't remember what the timeline is, within a year or year and a half, so it's not something that is a lifelong of adjustment or learning. It's pretty recent. It's still adjusting, healing. And also I was something I realized very early on when I realized she was going to have these prosthetic limbs, is that I didn't want them to be like a magical fix. They're not great. They don't always work right, because even now technology and prosthetics is amazing, and it's getting better at a very fast rate, and that's fantastic. But again, it is still, you go through 30 some years of your life with one set of operating mechanisms for your body, and suddenly there's a new one. And so there's a lot of things where it is an adjustment. And then of course, just the basic idea for anybody with any limbs at all, working a desk job, suddenly going into this situation with unfamiliar gravity and a whole lot of physical exertion and physical aggressive, traumatic actions. Of course, that's going to be something that, having prosthetic limbs doesn't make that easier. It makes it different, but it doesn't actually make it, you're not suddenly more powerful or anything. It's just, living with a different kind of body. So that was something that was always while writing, I always had to sort of make sure I reoriented myself into her point of view in that. It's like, okay, what would she not notice? What would she notice? Like, she thinks of her prosthetic limbs just like, that's my hand, that's my leg, and yet they work slightly differently. So, you know, I hope it works well. It is science fictional. It's not, you know, based on what current medical science is. It's just like an extrapolation. So
I think it's refreshing though to see a character with, you know, who's dealing with that kind of situation where, you know, it avoids that disability trope of the magical cure. It's like, oh well, everything broke you, but now it's fine because science or because magic, or
right, yeah,
you know, seeing that kind of stuff happen. And because that's not really very realistic. Like, I think even in the most, you know, out there types of like magical worlds or science fictional worlds, like, it's like you said, it's learning to deal with a completely new set of limbs. Like, that is going to be hard no matter how
right,
well
yeah,
crafted they are.
Also, and just in like, and part of that is like, a lot of it is character and about, you know, thoughtfully writing a disabled character, but a lot of it is also world building. And this is a world in which technology breaks. Like, it's, you know, how good it is depends on what you can afford and what, you know, how you use it and what you have access to. So it's, you know, like, there's no assumption that everybody is immediately going to have the best available thing. So there was a lot of thinking about that too, like about, again, how the medical debt and this, you know, sort of like, it's not an officially like an indentured servitude, but it's basically an indentured servitude that she finds herself in, affects like how she, like the relationship she has with this, like these prosthetics that she has to pay for. And so that was like, it's all part of, you know, like the character in the world, like overlapped in that when you're writing something science fictional that is about body modification on some level, even though I'm not really making any like grand sweeping like comments on, you know, body modification or like human body changes. It is still part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a little bit about sort of doing a lot of research about AIs.
Yep.
I'm curious, like, so what kind of research did you do for the book? And like, obviously you have a background in science. Like, how does that help you out, or maybe hinder you even when you're writing science fiction?
I have a background in like the physical sciences. I don't have any background in computer programming or anything. So just to like get that out of the way. So I started out, I read a whole bunch of books about like theories of AI, a lot of books about like where people think AIs will evolve to, like how they could evolve, like how they could become smarter than people someday. Oh, thank you, Leah. I read this book, which is amazing. It's called
Cool.
You Look Like a Thing and I Love You by Janelle Shane. And it's about how artificial intelligence works now. And it's also one of the funniest nonfiction books I've ever read in my life. It's so funny, highly recommended. But I also read some very, very like serious AI books. This one is way more fun than the serious ones. So I read a bunch of like articles where people are like, well, obviously in 20 years, AIs are going to start building smarter AIs and take over the universe. And watched a bunch of like TED Talks and lectures and stuff. It was very like I cast a broad net because I didn't really know what I wanted, like how much detail I wanted to go to. And I don't go into a huge amount of detail because it's because first of all, like making up something in that level when you don't have expertise in it just makes you look like an idiot. But also because I think it would be not very interesting. Like, I just don't think that's like a whole lot of prose detail about how an artificial intelligence works is not the way to make a thriller. I think I wouldn't read it. I would.
Why not drag it out with 10 pages of description?
So, like I try to learning from all these things, and mainly what you learn when you read a whole bunch about AI is that nobody really knows how it's going to evolve or how fast it's going to evolve. All of the predictions are wrong. Like, they just keep being wrong. It's like doomsday like predictions, but AI is developing, and it's developing in ways people didn't fully expect. And that's kind of fun, but also it's still very much built by humans who have ridiculous prejudices and biases and blind spots and assumptions, and all of that goes into it. So what I took from that was that there's a couple of AIs in the book actually, and they have like kind of different personalities. You know, you kind of have to not to get too spoilery, but like their different functions result in different like actions. And so I sort of thought about it most in terms of like, what would people build and how would people react to it? Like bringing it back to the characters, because, you know, that's what I hope people will care about. I don't think anybody reads my books to like get deep thoughts about technology.
I read them for the murder. Obviously.
Yeah, that's what most people read them for, I hope. That's why I write them. But and then in the more general sense, like my science background, like it's Mary Elizabeth says, for the dead bodies. That's why everyone reads them. But in the more general sense, like I do have a science background, and I think like there's not a huge amount of like really technical detail. I'm not writing hard sci-fi where like everything is rigorously argued and thought experiments that, you know, have logical conclusions and stuff, again, because it's about dead bodies and explosions and people running lots of places. There's a lot of running in this book. But what it does, like that science background and like physics background does do is mean that I can set it on an asteroid mine and be fairly confident that I get, you know, the general feel of what it would be like to be in a place that has very small gravity, that is very uneven, because asteroids are very small bodies and they're kind of lumpy and weird, and just like those kinds of setting details I think I can do fairly well, because I know what kind of questions to ask and what to look up, and like I have that baseline of knowledge.
Yeah, so. I mean, I know if I ever wrote a sci-fi book, you would be crying into your whiskey, because I'd be calling you every day like, help, I don't know where to start my research on this, because
I think anybody who wants to write a sci-fi book should. I think all that information, like we have the internet now, all the information is readily available, but there is a learning curve when it comes to just knowing what information you need. I think
that's exactly it. It's like, it's not so much about that you can't find it on your own. It's like, do I need to search for this thing, or this thing? Like if you're not super fluent in the area of science that you're writing about, it helps to have somebody help you narrow that down.
Right. Yeah.
So you know what you're looking for.
And like just sort of certain things, like you just have to kind of be a mental pack rat with weird scientific information. Like there's a part of this that, like, again, they're on an asteroid, mostly like in an enclosed space, but like the asteroid does have an outside. And I just remember probably watching on some like astronomy show at some point, like, oh, with that low gravity, like asteroids are like mostly dust, covered with dust. But if you stir up the dust, it just hangs because there's no atmosphere, there's no air, there's very little gravity. So it's not like you have this whirl that settles or anything. It's just things like that where you have to think about, like, how is this different from walking down the street today? Because it is a different, you know, very different setting. But also we haven't walked on asteroids. So again, there's a little bit of freedom in what you can make up. So
sure. And I think I get a little messed up sometimes by all the various sci-fi shows. Like nobody can afford to film or create a situation that is, you know, without gravity really that easily. Yeah, so it's like we're constantly watching shows that like reinforce the physics of our own world without necessarily thinking about the physics of our own world. So that was another thing I thought was very cool about Dead Space, is like it really thinks about the physics of the space that it's in, and so it really adds something to the setting and just makes it feel very real in a way that is awesome. It was
one of the authors, who is James S.A. Corey, I think it was Daniel Abraham, talking about making the Expanse TV show, said something like they use like magnetic boots for the actors to walk around, because if you tried to have every actor do like line, you know, have like whatever they call it when they're like on, trapeze lines or whatever, to look like zero gravity, like all the actors would just quit. They'd be like, no, we're not doing that. So like every show has like artificial gravity, even though that's not a thing. Like it's not a thing. It doesn't.
Right. Like once you dig into that,
way,
like,
yeah,
doesn't actually work at all.
Yeah. So I actually in Dead Space like do use like they don't use magnetic boots, but they do have like, because people evolved on Earth, like that's the way we move. So they do have like a kind of boot that helps them stick a little bit. And just because like we're humans, we try to make everywhere we go adjust to us. So I think that's
well, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of running in the book, and I have to say that I think like the idea of running in freaking gecko boots is terrifying. It's like those
nobody runs well. There's a
like,
lot of running, but it's not. Yeah, it doesn't. It rarely ends well.
No, it reminds me though of like the nightmare that you have when someone's chasing you but you can't run fast enough. Like I don't know if you ever had that nightmare, but it feels like that to me, and I'm like, oh, it's too vivid, too real.
Yeah, no, it's this is the second time I've done it where I wrote a book set in space that's full of action, and I've never been in space and I don't get into fights, and I was like, why do I keep doing this to myself? I don't know. It's fun. It's fun, but yeah, yeah.
Totally. Well, I would love to have some questions from the audience. If anybody wants to type your questions into the question box down at the bottom of your screen.
It looks like there's a few down there.
Are there? Oh my gosh, there's a bunch.
Yes.
For some reason, my Crowdcast wasn't showing it because probably something silly that I did. There's a question at the top that's really interesting about craft. But so as the author, you know all the answers. How do you know when a hint or a clue is a tantalizing hint versus giving away the farm?
Oh, hi, James. James is in my writer group, my local writer group. I think that is something that is not always easy to get. And I think the lesson that I've had to learn along the way is to actually tell more than I think I should. I think the instinct in first drafts is always to undersell everything, to be really subtle, to be like, ah, ha, ha, this is my clever hint. And if everybody, if they pick up on it, it'll be this great revelation. But I think oftentimes that's, well, at least for me, and I think from other authors based on what I've read, there's a tendency to like be a little bit too in love with our own cleverness in making the hints too subtle. And so I think for me, I have to remind myself like, no, you can be a little less subtle. You can give a little bit more away. And then I think the other thing that I always think about is that, is it okay? Like at what point is it okay to give it away to the reader? Like, at what point is it okay for them to figure it out? Because there is a point where you want them to figure it out. And there will be several points if it's a story that is built on building hints and, clues and foreshadowing. And to realize that, I think I mentioned this before, like you want your readers to figure it out like just a beat before the characters do, because there's that satisfaction in it. And again, to sort of ask yourself, okay, am I holding this information back because it gives too much away, or am I holding it back just because I want to hold it back? And then think about where the balance is there. So I think how you tell the difference is what impact does it have like on the reader? Does it make them feel, does it make them feel clever because it gives them something to figure out? Does it make them feel like they're being, or like on the other end, does it make them feel like they're being condescended to? Where, although, some mystery novels are kind of like the whole Sherlock Holmes things is built on being condescended to. Like that's the entire genre.
That's his whole job.
Yeah, it's like, you are too stupid to get this, but I'll explain it to you. And like, so I think, I guess my answer is to recognize that oftentimes as the person who knows everything in theory in our brains, as the author, our instinct is to tell too little, to show too little, and then reveal it all at the end, like, a big explosion of, Hercule Poirot in the drawing room with all of the suspects. Whereas for a reader, it's more satisfying to have a series of steps along the way where they, like a series of ahas along the way. Right. They can feel that multiple times while reading the story.
And I think you're right. There's kind of that balance of tension of like the reader figuring it. There's the tension of wanting to try to figure out what's going on, and that pulls the reader through. And then once they figure it out, there's the tension of, oh no, when is the character going to figure it out before something gets really bad for them, or somebody else gets killed. Or it's like that kind of give and take between those two kinds of tension, I think, throughout the book, and it keeps ramping up as you get closer to the ultimate mystery.
Right. And I think that there is a balance there, and I think that doing both of them is like, we always think about the mystery writing just as the first one, the setting of clues and leading to the conclusion, but the like enriching the reader's emotional experience is actually the more important one, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny to hear you talk about sort of how you feel like you undersignal in early drafts, because I think I do too, but for different reasons. Like, I have a really hard time figuring out what the clues are all going to be until I've written the whole freaking thing out, and I have to go back and like plug in the hints sometimes.
I actually think that's what most mystery writers do, is like, I think that's the other key, is that it almost never works on the first draft. You have to go back and be like, okay, what do they need to know to get to this step? Okay, they need to know this, and how, there's a lot of revision involved.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I guess, true of all of us writers, no matter what process we use. There's always revision of some
That's
kind.
just what James wants to hear, don't you, James? Have you revised your memoir yet?
The revision process is painful, especially if you're an overwriter, which I am. I think we've commiserated about this before, where it's like, I think my worst one, I had 50,000 words got cut from this.
I do that regularly. I am a huge overwriter on my first drafts. I write pages and pages of stuff that has no business being anywhere.
I think it's kind of like the research process, though. At least for me, it's, you do that, like, you do all your research and then 10% of it makes it into the book, but you need that underpinning to show the tip of the iceberg, if that makes sense.
Well, because I rarely plan. I mean, I'm learning to plan a little bit more as I write, but so much of the first draft is just me figuring out what the story is. Right. So I overwrite it dramatically to like tell myself various versions of the story, and then I go back and cut entire chapters and sequences and scenes and characters and plots and settings.
Been there, done that. I feel you. Yeah. Terrible. A question that's popped up to the top also is how has your interest in true crime shaped your writing? Question
Who asked that? Aaron. I have always been interested in true crime, and I have always been writing. So that's actually kind of hard for me to figure out. I would say that one thing that I think about a lot now, over the last couple of years, where, true crime has really exploded as like a genre that is very popular, and there's, a lot of availability, a lot of different kinds of storytelling in which we can hear about it, and oftentimes hear the same or similar stories in different formats, is how to tell these stories that never have happy endings, because even if somebody gets caught and go to prison, they're still a murderer. So you're telling a story about tragedy and trauma that, is almost always about like petty human failings. And I think that is something that's actually really helpful to remember when we're writing any kind of fiction, but especially this like sort of big broad field of speculative fiction where we can get caught up in the world building and the robots and dragons and all this stuff. It's like, no, to remember that like people being jealous, people jumping to conclusions, people having prejudices, people, lying about little things, and the lies spiral out of control. That's where so much of like person to person, like, like conflict comes from. And you can put that into any setting, but just have to remember that, people mess up a lot. And it doesn't always mean they're bad people, although there are quite a lot of bad people. And it doesn't always mean they're good people. They're also good people. But it does mean that they have these failings. And I think that is something that I think about a lot when thinking about like how true crime stories are told, because it is a genre that is very much about storytelling, and how it tells the stories has changed very much over the years to, focus on murderers and focus on the victims, focus on, cultural trends, or focus on gruesome details. And these are all decisions that we make when we're writing fiction. So we have to think about, what we're doing when we're doing it. So I do think there's a lot of that in the back of my mind as I, usually when I write in the morning and then I go take a walk, and usually I listen to a true crime podcast while I take a walk. And I don't think, it's not like a direct correlation, but it is like shifting gears of storytelling to remind yourself to look at the human, to remember the human tragedy in whatever you're telling.
That's probably why we both get told that we write character-driven books.
Yes. Also, I assume there are people who write books that don't have tragedy in them, but I don't know those people. So.
I mean, that's murder is what it's all about. I don't even know what to do when I can't murder somebody by chapter 2.
As I was saying that, I was like, people like write happy romances and stuff, but I don't. So there's always a tragedy and a trauma in there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I think that that's a great way of framing it too. And a good point that different kinds of media have chosen different ways to tell those stories, and that we gain something by listening to podcasts, by watching TV shows, by reading books. Because I think one of those pieces of advice that's always given to writers is read. It's like, okay, but it's okay to watch TV. It's okay to listen to a podcast. Why not?
Yeah.
You get a different type of storytelling from all of that.
And video games too. Play games.
Yeah.
Yes.
Fire Emblem.
Yeah, especially for Fire Emblem. And also I think that one thing that thinking about true crime in particular as a documentary genre, thinking about how you frame it is something that I think a lot of fiction writers could pay more attention to, like myself included. Is like, how are you framing this story? Whose perspective is being told, whose actions are being highlighted, because that's something I think when we sit down to write, we kind of go with the flow of what we have in mind, with what character we have in mind, but then we often have to go back and sort of interrogate what we're doing. It's like, is this story that we're trying to tell the story that we actually want to tell? And so I think that's something that the true crime genre on a big scale has grappled with, for years or probably longer, and is continuing to grapple with.
I think those conversations are really important right now too, and are happening more and more, because we're definitely starting to question, is it my job to write this story, or am I trying to make somebody else in this story into a teachable moment? All the books that we saw about, queer characters, where it's like, oh, the straight white person gets to learn about, what the truth of life is from their gay friend that died, and that's like, ooh, that
I know which book you're talking about.
Yeah, and now it doesn't seem like a good idea anymore.
No,
So
and I do think
that kind of narrative and what it means.
Right, and I think, to bring it back to Erin's question, true crime has had a very specific and conscious shift from focusing on these killers are crazy to why did people ignore these victims? And that is, the framing that is now preferred for a lot of these things. It's why are some humans and their lives and deaths ignored when others are, glorified? And I think that is the same kind of thing. It's why are we, privileging this kind of story over this kind of story when, when we sit down to write something, or we sit down to give awards to something, or review something, or promote something. So
yeah, and that's a whole kettle of fish.
yes.
So to a more lighthearted question that's gotten bumped to the top, what was the weirdest thing you had to Google or look up while writing this book?
Gosh, I don't know. Let's see. Man, that's a hard one. Weirdest things. I will say, like, this isn't weird in like a funny way. It's just, I feel like people probably don't Google this a lot, but I spent a lot of time trying to find information on like exactly how far away and how big like a certain group of asteroids is. And like, nobody knows. So I was constantly looking that up, and like it was stupid. I don't know why I kept hoping that like NASA would be like, by the way, now we know. But let's see, other things. I don't know. I don't know what the weird research into this one was.
There was probably a lot of it, really.
There probably was a lot of it, but I don't ever think of it like as I'm doing it. You know, I just think I have to know this thing. So here is this thing that I will say a lot of the AI research was weirder than I expected, because I thought, like, I think the impression that we get from like pop cultural views of how AI will evolve is that, oh, it's becoming smarter and soon they will become our robot overlords and we have to learn to make them, you know, benevolent instead of evil and all this stuff. But it's actually like again, this book, like, actually AIs are so dumb that they can't like tell giraffes from dogs and things like that, where you're just like, oh, that's where we're at. We're not at the AI overlords. We're at, is that a giraffe or is it a dog? And we don't know. So I think that was entertaining, just to realize like how far from like the conception of what science fictional AI is from what real, like, where we actually are was. I was continually surprised by that. So
that book sounds really good. Now I'm really curious.
It's great.
Everybody wants to know, but especially Leah, why you dedicated your book to such silly cats.
Because I love them. Yes.
Do you have Link? Is he in your room?
I don't have him. He's probably out with Leah. But yes, no, I did dedicate the book to the cats because, no, I had a serious reason for doing it. And it's because 2020 was stupid, and having the cats, oh, here he is. Having the cats was the only good thing. This is Link.
Link.
He's very mad and bad. As I looked around the year, I was like, oh, this is Mochi. Oh, she's very mad too. Oh, she's mad. She does not like this.
So mad. They don't want to be on Crowdcast.
Yes, they don't care that I dedicated my book to them, but I did anyway.
As the dedication says, they were very good company in a very bad year.
Yes.
I think that was true for many of us with cats.
Also, because writing the book was so traumatic for me, I didn't want to inflict that on any person that I know. The cats can handle it. Now I have cats.
They'll never know. It's all part of the author wardrobe, a nice patina of cat hair.
No, that's constant. Yes.
Makes total sense. Another fun question is, as an author of sci-fi, YA, and middle grade, which genre do you find comes the most naturally or is easiest to write for you, or which is the hardest?
Honestly, okay, so I think the hardest is YA for me. I feel like that's even though that's where I started, I don't feel like it really comes that naturally to me. I have to put a lot of extra thought into be like, yes, teenagers. I would say I actually think so. The middle grade book that I've written, and then I'm working on another one right now that hasn't been announced yet, but hopefully will be sometime soon. Those actually come pretty naturally to me, because I think that being a 12-year-old who wants to just go have magical adventures is kind of like where my development is sort of stuck. So like I love to write all kinds of different things. I love to write all kinds of different genres. But when I sit down to write like a middle grade fantasy, I'm like, I can write this. And it just kind of, it's just easy to work out. Not because I think children's books are easier. I think in many ways they're harder, but because the framework of like the fantasy world as viewed from a 10 to 12-year-old is something that, like, I read so many books like that when I was that age. And I think there's that, thing where something gets ingrained in us when we're developing our reading, our literary experiences. And that's kind of where mine got ingrained.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, obviously all of my published books right now are YA, so I've been in that terrible hell space for many years now. But I think it kind of comes back to something actually you were talking about earlier about characters making bad decisions. And I'm like, well, teenagers make a lot of bad decisions.
Yeah.
Good books tend to be about people like bad decisions make good books. Is kind of how I think about writing. It's like whenever your character has agency and is making bad decisions, that gets you somewhere.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's like, how many bad decisions can somebody make before you just want to like bang the character in the head with a hammer, which I've definitely been there with some of my narrative books.
Like for me, the middle grade books are especially fun because like that age when you're like, 9, 10, 11, 12 is when you're really starting to like look outside like the core of what your like family and home is and like discover the world. And there's something about that is lends itself to these stories of like adventures. If I had to write a contemporary middle grade, I don't know if I could do that. I think that would be very difficult for me. But when it's in a fantasy setting, there's something about the adventure and the discovery that I just feel like it pulls naturally along. And I like when I write books about adults, like it feels comfortable in a different way. And it's like, oh, this person is jaded and over it. And it's like, well, I can relate to that. So I think there's it's a little bit more challenging just because it's so close to being like what lessons has, and I would say this is more true of Dead Space because the main characters in Salvation Day are actually pretty young. They're in like their early 20s. So they're still kind of kids, where it's like, okay, like, how do you tell the story of someone who's already been through like a whole life worth of story and now is doing a whole like second act? And I think that was a little harder to figure out.
It's definitely harder. But it can be really fun too, because there's so much that informs how they react to situations. And then kind of like we talked about earlier, that like Hester having that layer of here's who I was and then here's who I am, and trying to kind of put together those two parts of her life that are so different from each other.
Yeah. And I think for me, like I used to be a scientist and I don't regret at all not like following through on that, but I can sort of be like, I remember being a young, eager scientist and now I am not. So even though,
now you're a grumpy writer.
You care way more about it than I ever did. It's still, it's something that it's like, oh, you could still like, I can still look at the steps to be like, how do you get from there to there? And
yeah, absolutely. Speaking of middle grade or just like being in that younger age, Kathleen has a question about what books really formed you as a writer, like books that you read as a teen or younger, like the first kind of book where you're like, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do.
I actually remember when the book I read that made me think, oh my gosh, I wish I could do that. And it was Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is, it's about 13-year-old kids who have a weird experience. And it's, it's this very, very atmospheric, spooky, kind of weird, like very, like has a really intense like tone and feel to it. So it's one of these things where like I was reading it and just thinking like, wow, I wish I could do that. But other like when I was a young person, I was very much one of those. Oh, and Leah's bringing this. We have this on our gate, which is also now kind of moldy. We're gonna have to throw it out. But,
oh no!
Yes, but again, like I read a whole lot of like before YA was a thing, like YA-ish horror, like Christopher Pike and R.L. Stine. And then I went into reading Dean Koontz, and I was the kind of English class snob who wanted to read all the classics, which I haven't read since I was 17 now. So, it was a lot of like me pretending I understood like this highbrow stuff that smart kids are supposed to understand, and then like aliens invading your high school. So that's pretty much the range of what I read when I was a kid.
I was kind of the same, although I think I'm probably less well read in the classics than you are, just because I was very bad about that, and I went to a weird high school. But I was always reading like some fantasy book under my desk. Like I got caught red-handed too, like in civics class, reading I think Patricia Reedy's books, and which were some of my root books that definitely
I love the Dealing with Dragons books.
Yes, they're so good.
Yes.
And it was like that first like fiery princess who wasn't going to take crap from anybody type of book.
Yeah.
And I got caught. I remember my civics teacher caught me, and it was 7th grade, and he like just walked up to my desk and he looked at me down at me, and he was like 6'5" or something. He was a former basketball player, and he looks down at me. He's like, "Is that a good book?" And I just like looked up at him, and I was like, "Yes." And he was like, "Well, carry on." And I got an A in his class. I mean, I did all the work. I didn't care about what he was talking about. So he was just like, whatever. So,
you get away with a lot if you get an A in the class.
It's true. Yeah, that was kind of my philosophy in life. It's like I can be a total jerk and do what I want as long as I get all my work done and I don't piss anybody off too much.
Yes.
It worked out all right. I think we have time for maybe one more quick question. Do you want to talk about plot, your setting, or your ghoul book that someone wants to know about?
This? No, just whichever one's at the top, you could ask.
Okay. Do you plot your mystery/puzzle books before the writing? Like, are there index cards with thumbtacks and string before you start writing characters?
No. No.
Nope.
No, no. The most organizing I do is I write, I have I use a paper notebook, and I write notes, like lists of things, like what should happen next, just like write lists to myself. And then I go back and all of the actual plotting detail work is in the revisions. And it's super, super inefficient way to write, but I haven't quite figured out another way to do it yet. So it's
kind of fun though. Yeah. You get the discovery along with because if you plan everything out to the last tiny detail, sometimes
I know where I wanted to end. Like with Salvation Day, I knew where I wanted to end. With Dead Space, I actually didn't. And you know this because you read early drafts of it. I had no idea how I wanted it to end. It
eluded you for a few drafts, really.
Yeah. No, I didn't know I didn't even know like how I wanted the ending to feel in the most vague sense. So it took a lot of working out how to get there. So, but no, I didn't. I did all of the plotting of clues in the second and third drafts.
Awesome. Well, we're out of time. That was fun.
Yeah. Sorry we couldn't get to every question, guys. You guys had so many good questions for our author.
And
That's great, though. I think you had some really great, thoughtful insight to, your writing process and all your books, especially this one. So if you guys are excited about everything that we talked about tonight, go ahead. Just a reminder, again, there's that buy books, sign books button at the bottom. Thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you, Audrey, for moderating. Thank you for Kali for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And yeah, with that, have a great night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.
All right.
Good night. Thank you.